Now we come to the seventh Sufi thought. There is one moral, the love which springs forth from self-denial and blooms in deeds of beneficence. One moral, the love which springs forth from self-denial and blooms in deeds of beneficence. Now, hearing the phrase self-denial might give one pause. One thinks, do I want this? Self-denial? Do I wish to deny myself? What would come of that? What is meant by self-denial? We have to reflect on it. And when we do reflect on it, we see that this rule has to do with, well, it's not a rule, it's a thought, the seventh Sufi thought, but this thought has to do with ethics, morals. How do we practice a moral way of life? And what the philosophers have reminded us about down the centuries is that the best way to live a moral life is to act in a way that you would have another act. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In other words, you have to step out of your subjectivity and say to yourself, if it wasn't me in this situation, if it was someone else, how would I advise that person act? If there's no benefit that is going to accrue to me, if it's just a matter of principle, if it's a question of universal right, universal justice, if I suspend the fact that it's me, how should anyone act in this situation? What's the right thing to do? That's the consideration that shifts one out of a self-interested framework to a universal framework, to a framework based upon values that are not driven by one's self-interest. So Murshid speaks here of self-denial in the sense of suspending one's sense of personal ambition, personal fear, personal appetite, all of the drives that can get the better of us unless we're very transparent to our own processes of thought and feeling. Step back from that conditioned urge to act out. Pause and reflect. So when one pauses, then one asks, what does love call for? What does that larger principle of connectedness, kindness, communion in the spirit, what does that call for? Not merely what does my selfish interest require in this instance. So actually there are stages of morality. The first one, Moshe describes them in Moral Culture. The first one is the morality of reciprocity. That means looking for evenness in all of one's dealings, not trying to get the better of someone else. Pay for what you receive. Don't take more than you give. That's the first thing. And here, the rule is the law that applies equally to everyone. We are all expected to be in accord with this principle of mutuality, reciprocity, and evenness, without any exception. But then there's a second level of morality which goes beyond just doing one's duty, just doing the minimum to repay one's debts. There's another principle which is beneficence, which is to say, yes, even if that one has not paid me something, I'm ready to give something if it would help. So that's a higher morality, the morality of generosity. And it comes from love. The more that love is awakened, the more it flows. Of course, we all notice this. When we're in a state of love, then our actions naturally reflect kindness. And if we're in a state of animosity, which is really love that has clenched up. You see, the tendency, the natural affection, the natural goodwill of the human heart, when it cannot sustain itself, when it lacks that insight or that nourishment that is its food, and when one imagines one's own feeling betrayed or snubbed or devalued, that's the seed of all of these qualities of malice and ill will and resentment and so forth, which are permutations of love actually, but love narrowed down, love distorted, love confused. But when more and more that love element is clarified, is made transparent and clear, then it comes naturally not only to meet everyone in this space of reciprocity, but to, whenever possible, go beyond the call of duty and give of oneself. And then it isn't self-denial in the sense of castigating oneself, or it isn't. There's no harsh negation of anything. In fact, the self becomes continuous with all selves. There's no boundary between self and other. There's no diminishment of the self. There's an expansion of the self so far that love flows. Love of other, love of self. There's no difference anymore. It's only this one universal kindness. Great story that exemplifies the principle of beneficence is one that maybe you've heard me tell before. I do sometimes repeat stories, maybe often. But there's certain ones that one wants to repeat because they're so eminently memorable. And one of them, especially, I like to repeat because it comes from the Buddha via Nur. She retold the story in her Jataka tales. It's the story of the great elephant. How those beleaguered travelers, they were exiles for their country, they were refugees. People who were driven out of their land, actually, by a tyrant, and wandered in the desert. How they were crossing the desert and came to an oasis. But there were many of them, and there was very little food to eat in that oasis. There was a little bit of fruit, but it wasn't enough. And the refuge they were seeking was still further in the distance. And so an elephant saw them. This elephant who lived such a happy life in the oasis, dancing through the banana trees. That's how Nur describes it. A great picture of happiness, dancing through banana trees. And so he saw here are refugees in great need, and there's not enough food here, and they won't survive their journey across the desert. So he said, friends, go to the other side of the hill, and there you'll find something to eat. He raced up the hill, and he leapt and crashed down, and his body was broken, but it became food for these travelers. And when they reached his body, they were so moved. They had never encountered anything like this kindness, this graciousness, this love for them, this concern for their well-being. And they said, how can we eat this elephant who is such a noble being, such a great being, someone whom we should honor to the utmost? And how could we eat such a one? But another one in the group answered, we must partake of the elephant to honor his sacrifice. He did this for love. We must honor his sacrifice and respect his intention. And in a sense, in their partaking of his body, his life continued through them. He was one elephant in the oasis, but now he was 1,000 travelers who now had the energy to reach their goal and to raise their families, and so life would continue. He made that great sacrifice. So that's a higher morality. He didn't say, well, if you give me such and such, I'll give you something. He saw here was the time to just give. Now one imagines that the elephant dancing through the banana trees, but also leaping from the hill must have been in Noah's own mind when she chose to give herself in the cause to protect those who were victims of genocide.